Thank you, Cousin Mark. We have a big family, so you know, there's like 100 first cousins. And because I was the oldest on one side of the family by, you know, 5 or 10 years, I hadn't even met half of them yet. But he's my favorite. And listen, I've got Dan Sullivan sitting over here, and there's a reason for that, because he's going to help me, you know, direct this discussion, give me some questions, and, you know, cut out the Doug Peacock bullshit a little bit. And Dan is my oldest friend. I've known him for almost 50 years. I met him at a what do you call it, laundromat? Laundromat, a laundromat. Sorry, man. I'm a writer, you know. You know, in West Glacier, Montana, and I had my collie dog with me at that time. It was 1977, and I was there because there was you know, I'd worked for the Park Service pathetically for almost a decade. And, you know, the reason I worked for the Park Service is back in the you know, early 70s, Ed Abbey and I shared jobs like custodians, we were called. But it's kind of like, you know, like taking care of a big wildlife, a private wildlife conservation area down in Aravaipa Canyon in Arizona. And then, you know, after that, you know, Edward, who was my senior by 15 years, said, Douglas, you should apply for employment, seasonal emploment with the National Park Service. They give you a quitting date to look forward to. And so I was up there within the Department of Interior. I was downwardly mobile. I was up as high as a climbing ranger at GS5 when I worked down my way, you know, to GS3 as a fire lookout in Glacier National Park, where I met Dan Sullivan, and eventually expired at a GS0 to the great relief of the Department of Interior. So Dan, thank you for being here. And you know, writers are probably, you know, they're less, I'm going to read a little bit, but they're less interested in reading than probably talking with their friends and their audiences about anything they have a question about. So I'd like to keep this, you know, as reasonably loose as possible, and we can wait till the end. But you know, I'd like to hear comments and questions for you, which I will address, you know, during, after the talk, and into the book signing. I'd be glad to. Anyway, I got a call from Clark Abbey today, Ed Abbey's widow, and we are collaborating on the making of the Monkey Wrench movie. I wouldn't say things are going stellar. These let me find a word that doesn't sound like asshole. These, you know, they've had to write since 1993 and they haven't made a goddamn movie yet, so I'm a little, you know, agitated. And if they don't get on with it and make it this year, and Clark and I have collaborated on the script and things like that, I think we're going to jerk the rights back. But what a movie to make for these incredible times that we're in. They're not good times. They're just, you know, they're the reason we're here, is what I believe. You know, the reason we're here is the state of the planet. And everything about it is swirling out of control these days, or seemingly so. And you know, I wrote this book as an attempt to approach those conditions, and you'll have to determine for yourself. You know, when I talk to, I've been on the road a little bit, reading from the book, sometimes talking to young people, and young people, one of the most common questions I get is, you know, look, I want to be a conservationist, but how do I start out? And I almost invariably tell them to, you know, spend a little time in the wild by themselves, arm themselves with friendship, but probably, above all, start in your backyard. And here I am. I've been on the road for a few months, but, you know, this is where I come back to. And we need, you know, we need to pay attention to our backyard. we've got a lot of stuff going on. Right now, in the early springs, since I spend a lot of time on grizzly bears, and this is a very dangerous time. Male grizzlies are out by this time of year. Females tend to come out with their cubs this month, but males have been out since perhaps March, and they indeed are a dangerous animal to be around in the spring. A male grizzly will often find, food is thin in the spring, and our grizzlies here, if they find a carcass, male grizzlies, based on my own sample size, will defend that carcass almost 50% of the time. And a couple of years ago at Baker's Hole, there was a local man, a knowledgeable man, who ran into a male grizzly who was defending a moose carcass. The moose carcass was sunk in water and he couldn't smell it, because this guy should have, he would have been aware. But anyway, the bear killed him. And, just across the river from my place, upriver in the valley, we had another tragedy this year. A well-loved man that stumbled probably onto a male grizzly. We don't know all the conditions, but he was bedded there for a reason, and no one knows that. But these are tragedies. No matter if it's the bear, the human, and so it's a dangerous time for grizzlies, because we've got a repressive regional, state, and federal regime that really goes after our top predators and kills them all. If you were a wolf, it's even more deadly. Montana's legislators, it's just a system of murderous hate war at our apex predators. And, we're so embedded with fear and hate, and I think evil. It takes your breath away. And I think we must find a way to deal with these issues, and I've mainly, my campaigns often are, in federal court, but this is our state. And we don't know these animals, and the people that hate these animals don't know anything about them at all. And I endlessly believe that we fear what we hate, and that's the beginning of these bottomless, they're hate actions, not unlike we see in the human world. And these happen to be aimed at Montana. I've been in Montana off and on for well over 50 years, but I never thought this was happen so fast. And I don't really know how to take it on yet, but I can just tell you that's brand new on my agenda with my friends and allies. And we got to, we have to have some respect for life. Above all, it's respect for life. We need to find a crack in that machine, which is, killing wolves and grizzlies from helicopters. And it's also attacking, my efforts with Save the Yellowstone Grizzly. And my friends, Bill Carter and Megan Riley, are going to be tabling tonight for Save the Yellowstone Grizzly and the projects that we're right on. These guys are helping me raise money, which I know nothing about. I mean, I'm so doofless, and it may be deeper than that. It's not flattering at all. But we've got collectively a machine that maybe starts with the Montana State Game and Fish and Parks, but it's backed up and reinforced by the Federal Wildlife Service and executed by the Department of Agricultural Animal Damage Control. And they kill basically, they have their own argument, but I hired a law firm to take them to court. They attack any grizzly who seems to be wandering outside of its natural boundaries. And, that is crazy. It's like they have noted and studied, rather than grizzlies, birds a lot. the birds tend to be wandering, but I bet you if you interviewed the birds, you'd find some reasons for that wandering. And in the case of Yellowstone's grizzlies, it's simply, not simply, it's complicated to hell, that's a stupid thing to say. But it's climate change, with all its ramifications, and the essence of which is that the carrying capacity of Yellowstone ecosystem is decreasing because of wildfires that tend to come back. Instead of forests, it's grasslands, and these bears are, they're seeking a solution to this human-imposed condition called climate change, and we are, we humans are going to have a terrifying summer, I believe, even starting this year, with California-style endless wildfires. Anyway, it's got all my attention, what little I have. My publisher called this book, a memoir of climate change, and that's fair enough. I didn't intend to write a memoir, but I tend to see, the wild lands and the problems of the world and the wars of the world, through my personal lens. I'm going to read a couple very short pieces, and then Dan Sullivan, you probe me or direct me anytime you want. This book is kind of a compendium of the kinds of probes and expeditions that I've done all my life. And the material I included was stuff that I hadn't published before that had a point. For instance, finding the greatest poacher of Yellowstone was Edward Howell, a bison poacher in Stringent Creek, and 1894. I found his camp chasing grizzlies back there. I will mention that. Another chapter is about looking for the last Mexican grizzly down in Chiricahua and the Sierra Madres. And indeed, we found that sign of that last grizzly, and in the course of that, I encountered my first jaguar. And I'll just read short pieces from this and let you guys make comments or whatever you want to do. I went over to Siberian country with a bunch of my friends, these climbing friends, and Tom Brokaw was among them. So, it's kind of got a local connection here. And we stumbled across a grizzly that later became the most famous modern man-eater. And I just say man-eater because it happened to be literal, but in fact, they're kind of equal opportunity, It's kind of like Yellowstone Lake. Anyway, Dan, I'm just going to read a few paragraphs, which are the opening of this book. And then please, come up with some. And if you can't, you guys come up with some. Okay. I think I can read this. Sorry, man, I'm old. No, oh shit. Excuse me, huh? I logged this is called Winter Count. It's the opening to this new book. I logged my life by winter counts in the fashion of Plains tribes who painted significant events on the inner sides of a bison hide. This might be a battle, a treaty, an encounter with a dangerous creature, finding a spirit animal, or possibly a winter so cold the cottonwood trees split apart. Though the indigenous peoples tended to mark each year, not every year of my life was worthy of a winter count. Some counts could come bundled in decades with only the rivulets of spring runoff and the emergence of bears to mark the in-between times. So it was with me. I started a new count in 1968. There was my life before the war that prepared me for a life in the wilderness. A good life, full of swamps, rivers, woods, deserts, and mountains. From 1965 to 1968, I worked as a Special Forces medic who attended too much collateral damage. That cowardly phrase they apply to the pile of small, dismembered bodies after a botched air attack. After March 1968, I applied the anger I had built doing that to the defense of wild things. dimly realizing that the fate of the earth and her inhabitants depended on uncompromising protection of the wilderness homeland and wild creatures. My war experiences, good and bad, prepared me for the fight. It was a gift. I learned to love grizzly bears. I also fell in love with the Lower Sonoran Desert, a romance started in the early 60s but broken by the separation of the war. Space and endless clean vistas, unbroken by the forest I so cherished up north. By late 1968, I had two opposing mistresses, grizzly bears in the northern Rockies and the desert southwest. When the bears hibernated, I hightailed it south. It's winter now, and I sit in a sun-filled desert wash. A few ground flowers are blooming, and the stalks of brittlebush show a rare yellow blossom. I sit several days' walk from where Ed Abbey is buried. This Lower Sonoran Desert country is still considered a wilderness, and I miss my buddies with whom I shared many of these adventures. Ed Abbey, Peter Matheson, Doug Tompkins, and Jim Harrison. I've always dreaded the loss of wild country so much that I cared not to live without it. Now another threat, the beast of our time, the warming planet, has etched into the sky, and every creature on earth bigger than a field foal is at risk of decimation or extinction. And there it is, back to Abbey's ancient quandary. What to do? Duty textures in with the joy of living fully and loving the earth. Except for a pledge to fight to the literal end, I never quite solved this problem. Everybody's mortality is in the lens now, and it's not necessarily a telephoto shot. Anyway. Well, what do you mean keep going? It's a whole goddamn book. It's 300 pages. Sorry.
I was just getting into it, man.
Oh, okay. Well, let me see if I got something else here. You know, the title of this book, Was It Worth It? You know, there's this place in the very southwestern desert of Arizona. It's the wildest place I could find in the continental United States, where you can walk 150 miles, not see a human boot print, cross a road, or be on a trail. And I did that 7 times end to end, and 1 time from I-8 down to Mexico, Grizzly. And in the wild, and I did it alone. You know, I carried my own water, and you got to know where to find water out there, because you know, in the summertime it goes dry, and so you got to watch it. And if you don't know where the water is, you die. So, you know, I had to carry 3.5 gallons of water to get between the water holes. And it was just a wonderful place because, you know, well, you got to like that kind of stuff. I understand. Not for everybody. But, you know, you're sitting there in a Bajada with this, you know, heavy pack, and you got to carry out your own water. And you're looking 50 miles away, and there's another mountain range, and you know there is a Tinaja, which is a natural, you know, water hole drilled by torrential rains into the rock that has water. And you look up there, and it's like 50 impossible miles, you know. And then you just walk there. You know, what a transformation it was when I first realized that. And, you know, that's country. But in the wildest, most remote places of that country, and until, you know, migration became, you know, more prevalent, and I ran across Ed Abbey's tracks once, I never saw a human track out there. And I mean, I did it, what, 8 times 100, you know, over 1,000 miles, I guess, or about. It beats me, it doesn't matter. It's all the same, but it was the greatest walking, maybe in my life. Anyway, in the most remote parts of this desert, sometimes I find inscriptions. You know, first of all, there's ancient petroglyphs from prehistoric peoples, Hohokam mostly, but also more recent, like humans and, you know, FEMA type stuff. But there was one collection of graffiti from about the early first century of 1900, 1906 to 1912. And this was a guy named John Moore. And he scraped and said, John Moore, 1907. And half the time it was followed by this inscription, was it worth it? Question mark. Now I never knew who the hell John Moore was. He was probably out there, it was during pretty low times economically. He's probably looking for a nickel's worth of copper. But, you had to be crazy to love that desert and be there in the summertime when it's 130 degrees. And, Lord knows, full of rattlesnakes, and stuff, jaguars, stuff I love, So that's where I got the title from. Well, I'll go over to the first chapter and just read a paragraph or two. Dan, you got to remind me of times because I don't want to run on too much.
I don't think anyone's going to complain.
Well, that's okay. I got it. I'll get to it. This is the first chapter is about Yellowstone. A long time ago. It was like in the 1970s when I was pretty much in there by myself. And I was crazy. I just come back from Vietnam, and I'm going to read you a couple opening paragraphs here to tell you how crazy those times were. Okay, and chapter 1 is called The Hayduke Ancestry. And I've got my Hayduke lives. Anyway, here I go. Oh, wait a minute, that's the first. The Hayduke Ancestry. And this is a quote from Ed Abbey. If wilderness is outlawed, only outlaws can save the wilderness. That's old Ed. Even today, the flash of a Hayduke Lives bumper sticker is not an uncommon sight on the byways and in the parking lots of America. For me, this signals a public acknowledgement that the writings and teachings of Ed Abbey still matter. We care about the wild ones and believe that maybe the wilderness is the only thing left worth saving. How did the fictional character of George Washington, Hayduke, come into imagining? Only Edward Abbey could know precisely how those particular threads came together. But the part of George that Ed borrowed from the real-life Peacock had distinct origins that were rooted in wilderness, in both the trauma and the value of recovering from war. The most indispensable wilderness experience in my life arrived quite accidentally in Yellowstone National Park during the decade after I returned from Vietnam. Accidental because I stumbled into the park's lodgepole pine forest at the peak of a hallucinatory malaria paroxysm. I'd had a lot in Vietnam, so I knew what was going on. It started in high eastern Wind River rain, so I knew it was coming. And I dreamed of grizzlies that turned out to be real bears. I had a fever of 105.6 when I went out of my mind. So I didn't know if the bears were real or not, but the tracks were all around where I decided to pitch my tent. I was kind of stupid back then. Okay. That experience can't be replicated today because of human crowding. It occurred long enough ago that the National Park Service didn't especially think a wacko hiding on their backcountry was worth looking for. That was a combat vet Ed Abbey met in 1968 and upon whom he later based the fictional character of George Washington Hayduke. With its wildlife, wilderness, and thermal areas of refuge from deep snows, I considered Yellowstone's backcountry a paradise, and I wanted to indulge in pockets of it without interference from the outside world. This was still possible in Yellowstone long before talks of bringing in fast food and the internet to National Park Service campgrounds. You remember that? Just a couple of years ago. Yeah. It also meant I had to hide out, like an escaped POW might have attempted in Vietnam. At that time, there was no sane boundary for me between living in the edges of Yellowstone National Park, and the fantasy of looting capture by the Viet Cong hunting for me in the jungles of Vietnam. That's really a crazy sumbitch. I had one close encounter in Southeast Asia and had yet to shake the nightmare loose. I wanted to chisel the episode out of my life like a malignant lesion, but back then I couldn't. I was terrified of somebody finding me camped in the woods of America. I traveled around with this irrational fear buried in my backpack while tramping across the meadows and through the lodgepole pine forest. The shrinks would later try to provide chunky terminology for this pathology. A decade and a half later, you know, PSDT and such, I never get it right. In the meantime, I prowled around Yellowstone like a madman. That's okay. Leaving no tracks in the rapidly melting snow. I filled the criterion for half a dozen paranoid categories, all of which I embraced as necessary for a life in the wild. It pushed me to the edge. My contact with park rangers was infrequent and cordial. Sometimes I came out of the woods to fly fish the Yellowstone River. My favorite band was Midway Geyser Basin, you know, where hot springs sprang up and young grizzlies sometimes swam. In October 1968, there were very few park visitors, and one ranger used to leave his patrol vehicle on the top of the golden grass-covered bluff and walk down to the river to ask how the trout fishing was. It happened to be great, with big 2 to 3 pound brown trout rising to small flies. His pleasant small talk constituted my entire social life. I really enjoyed that guy. But as soon as I hit the wilderness, I instinctually started sneaking around. I followed deep bison trails cut through the spring snow cornices in the afternoons, where my tracks would melt away in hours. And for instance, you know, my clothing, gear, and tents, mostly from Army surplus, were all earth covers, and I carried a white sheet in case a plane spotted me snowshoeing in the middle of a snowy meadow. And I had to cover up. So you just, you know, you hear it, you throw your pack down, jump on top of it, put the white sheet over everything. It worked every time. Any comments or questions? Okay, I got a... let me see what we got here. Well, you know, we're going to run out of time. This is a long book. Here, you know, I found the hunting camp of Edward Howell, the most famous poacher in the history of Yellowstone Park, according to their own superintendents at the time. And, you know, he was a buffalo poacher, you know, and he was actually in Stringent Creek, that's where that chapter took place. And I was, you know, I filmed Grizzly at that time, so I carried this kind of noisy Bolex 16mm camera, which I could only use when the wind was blowing or there was a river roaring. It'd be decades before I could get, you know, a modern, quiet movie camera, which, you know, I did, but it took a while. So, you know, one day I had, you know, in myself again, guerrilla camping, you know, I stumbled across grizzly tracks, a mother grizzly and 2 yearling cubs, and I followed those tracks up a Stringent Creek. And where there was a little open ground where there's a couple warm springs, they were digging, you know, and you know, they're digging in the trenches of voles, rhodentia, but you know, to get the nest out. And this happened to be, I think it would probably be mice or voles as opposed to, but anyway, little tiny rodent. And they kicked the nest out, she would. And then, you know, and then sometimes the nests were full of little mice. And the mice would scurry around, and then the yearling cubs would come up and gobble them up. So I shot, you know, a few minutes of that kind of footage, and they drifted away, and I drifted away too. And I went up this trailless, wonderful place. I found these huge hot springs that weren't on any topographic map, so that was, you know, very exciting for a guy like me. And I kind of spread out next to 101, and I took a little nap in the sun. So I got back up as late afternoon, and I started back downstream and I rounded a bend, and there was the same Grizzly family digging voles, their pocket mines. And I didn't want to bother them, so I decided, you know, there was like an elbow of timber, and I was going to cut across the neck of this ember. And you know, the snow had started to melt out. There's snow in the ground, but there were pockets of snow-free ground too. Rather than look for the place where I can't find it, I'll just tell a story. You know, so anyway, I started through, you know, I took up my snowshoes and started, you know, going through this timber patch. And I got, and it wasn't very big, it was like a quarter mile or so across. And I got about halfway through, and I started seeing axe-hewn trees. And then I looked around, there were quite a few of them. And there was a hanging log still stuck up there, and the remnants of, you know, some kind of camp table, bench, whatever, but, you know. And there was also some garbage around, old tin cans and bottles, quite a few bottles. They had a crown top on these bottles, which I looked up, and the crown top was invented in 1892, and Howell was busted in 1894. This was his camp, and you know, my neighbor John, who wrote the book on Grinnell, you know, I had written about this extensively, so I knew the background to it. That finding that camp and busting that guy, you know, gave direct issue to the Lacey Act, which really protected our national forests. It's still in effect today. And so that was a very big deal. I know what I was going to do. Dan, tell me what time it is. Okay.
22.
Oh. I injected this chapter because I feel so strongly about bison, I had to write something about it. Okay, so I'm going to read this. This is right when I discovered this camp, and I wrote this thing. I need to say something about bison. I consider the bison America's quintessential animal, as important to our hearts and souls as grizzlies or any other creature. My own partisan views are carved from decades of watching bison. All that time I lived in the backcountry filming grizzly bears, bison were my daily companions. Early in the 1970s, grizzlies were less common. You know, I was in Yellowstone for 25 years, in the backcountry at least. The grizzlies were less common. Sometimes you didn't see a bear for a week or so. That's true. But the bison were there every day, prancing, rolling, and bellowing, dominating the landscape. Watching them became an ecology of thinking. And these bison were the great-grandchildren, many times great-grandchildren, of the bison in America were, you know, at the time of contact, were estimated to be 60 million bison. You know, a herd of perhaps 10 million bison, and one herd was witnessed crossing the Iowa River. It took 3 days to get across. So, you know, the estimates might be, but it's a hell of a lot of bison. Anyway, of those, you know, 60 million, they shot them down in half a century, and I'll read about that. And these, you know, in 1902, they only had 23 wild bison they could count and not catch in Pelican Valley, Yellowstone National Park. These great herds of totemic animals have thundered through human consciousness since the beginning of our kind. Today, I have been fortunate enough to witness the tip of that ancient iceberg of animal craving when I saw the wildebeest of the Kalahari and the caribou Arctic's porcupine herd. But the most astounding herd to roam the face of the earth was the American bison of the Great Plains. The numbers we hear stagger the imagination. 60 million bison at the time of Lewis and Clark. The reasons given for their demise are the usual one. Manifest destiny, European domination and the need for agricultural lands, or a way to deal with the final solution to the Indian problem by eliminating their commissary, the bison. But there was something different about the way we went after the bison. Unlike wily wolves, fierce grizzlies, or indigenous people who fought back, the bison just stood there and took it. They were killed for their hides and tongues, for sport, and for the hell of it. The Army gave out free ammunition to any dude riding a railroad who could shoot them from the train, leaving millions of bison to rot and die. None of this adds up to answer the real question. Why did the bison hold a place of such reverence and respect for Native Americans for millennia, while European immigrants gleefully annihilated them in half a century? These two cosmogonies could not be more divergent. I've never quite been able to wrap my mind around this bedrock contradiction. Our American history books don't discuss this dark quandary that seems to represent the beginning of our Western relationship with the continent's wildlife and the land itself. These are the beasts we never knew. You know, bison, they have a ceremony of the dead, just like elephants. You know, when a bull dies in a bull herd, they all come around and rub a little fur off and lick, you know, anyway. I wrote this chapter called Treasure in the Sierra Madre. And I'll just read an opening paragraph because they're all different. I went down in 1985 into the Sierra Madre to look for the last sign of the last Mexican grizzly. And you can find grizzly sign where, you know, they live with black bear by the fact that grizzly bears are huge diggers. Black bear might tear up an anthill, but they don't dig much. So these, in this kind of pits and trenches or whatever the hell they are, they last for a long time, for years. So that's what I went down there looking for. But I'll just read the opening. I went by down there with a buddy who was very wonderful wildland. And this is called Treasure in the Sierra Madres, 1985. Just south of the colonial town of Casas Grandes, I unscrew the bottle and pass tequila to the driver of the pickup, who already holds a can of Tecate between his knees. He looks like he could use a few drinks. The international border crossing at Agua Prieta resembled a Three Stooges shakedown. The border police held us up for 2 hours until we bribed them with half of our pocket cash. Later, at the archaeological ruin at Old Casas Grandes, we almost went to jail. Tourists and people like us need to tread carefully in the northern part, in this part of the northern Mexican frontier. Anyway, my driver, I call him Scarf, he's quite a wild man. Okay, so, you know, we go down the highway away and we almost get, you know, busted at you know, ruin at Casas Grandes. Anyway, we leave Casas Grandes behind and head into the heart of rural Chihuahua. We have a map and know the name of the mountain range, but the land here is privately owned, mostly in huge ranches, and it's hard to get in the heart of the Sierra Madre, where we hear the last of the wildlife. The imperial woodpecker, the last Mexican grizzly bear, the jaguar, Gould's wild turkeys, and the Mexican gray wolf may still roam. Scarp is a big man, over 6 feet with a boxer's physique, maybe some Russian genes in there. His large ruddy hands grip the steering wheel with authority as we motor down the narrow highway. Traffic is thin. We watch the yucca-studded landscape pass by. We come over a ride and Scarp stomps on the brakes. What the fuck? He shouts to the empty desert. Far ahead, 3 government pickups block the road. Scarp looks for a place to get off the road or turn around, but the police, whoever the hell they are, have already spotted it. We have no choice except to talk our way through the roadblock. I point out to Scarp, we don't have firearms or dope aboard, but he isn't listening. If this sounds paranoid, you don't know Scarp. He is very good in an emergency or a scrape, but he sniffs out trouble behind every bush, even when there's not much there. This flavor of hypervigilance maxes out in the face of authority like a traffic stop or a boarding crossing, and brings out the cornered ferret aspects of Scarp's otherwise charming personality. you got anything?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to remind.
Or anybody out here, too.
Just remind everybody briefly, he's being sort of bashful here because what we have is what we have here is a guy who can help us all with the current PTSD that we're going through. He tries to downplay a little bit, but please ask him a question about how climate is affecting you, how the war is affecting you, how whatever it happens to be, because that's been my experience the last 45 years with him, and it's done wonders for me. So think about that. So when you're ready. So please, everyone.
So later on, in our Mexican trip, we finally get into this incredibly pristine mountain range, and the reason it's pristine is it's owned by a private rancher, and it's north of Chihuahua City, about 100 miles. And, you know, we have to go jump through some hoops to get in there, but it's worth it because nobody's been in there, and no one hunts it. That's why the animals are still there. And you know, at one time, you know, we started going up canyons. And we ran into a rare April snow. It's not a heavy snow; it's just a light thing. But you know, so the trickle of water coming down in no time, and we crossed, you know, a lot of new tracks. Like there's ocelots down there, and you know, Mexican wolves and jaguars, and also mountain lions and bobcats. So you got to, you know, telling the track sometimes a little tricky, but once you get into it, it's not. So you know, on day 3 or so, we crossed the track of this giant cat. Now, I know a lot about mountain lions, but this thing was big enough to be the track of a 200-pound mountain lion. I've never seen a kitty quite that big. And, you know, and all of a sudden we're traveling with it, and we see it every day. You know, it's behind us, it's ahead of us. And finally, we go up in the wildest part of the mountain range where I want to look for grizzlies. I figured out the habitat already. And I know these 9,000 ridges up there are prime places where grizzlies would have dug alpine stuff up there. You know, there's manzanita and scrub oak and all kinds of agaves of every species. So, you know, the night before going up on this mountain to find this sign, we're sitting down by the campfire, and it's a beautiful camp. It's a, you know, you camp under live oak with running water. You know, and Jesus Christ, it's beautiful and perfect. We're sitting there one night, you know, just feeding the fire, and we know the jaguar is around somewhere, but you know, not this particular night. And all of a sudden we hear, you know, coyotes, and way off to the side we hear a distant howling, and my God, it's wolves. I thought they'd be there. So we say nothing for 5 minutes. In the opposite direction, there's an answering howl. So, you know, it was such magic, you know, Mexican wolves in the Sierra Madres. And, you know, if we know we've got the jaguar, we've got the wolves, if only a Mexican grizzly would wander into the firelight, we'd have all the apex predators of the Sierra Madres, which, you know, that's why I went down. And the next day, we find grizzly sign on the top and come back down. And I'm just going to read this little section. We're sitting around the, you know, we're down in camp again after, you know, we're celebratory because we have found the sign of the last Mexican grizzly. A grizzly hadn't been sighted there for almost 10 years. And, you know, well, this was a sign on a live bear. It was real McCoy. Anyway, we're down making camp. We lean on our bedrolls by the glowing fire, listening to the night sounds of owls and goatsuckers. A coyote yaps from somewhere down the canyon. Then a coughing sound, close to camp, breaks the silence. The low vocalization is strange to my ears. It puzzles and alarms me, and for a very real minute, scares the shit out of me. It seems to be coming from a big cat, and that cat is very close. Holy shit, murmurs Scarp. We get up. I throw logs on the fire. The coughing is coming from just below the firelight. We are too alarmed and cautious to investigate, so we cling to the blaze. I can hear the brush moving. It's a jaguar for certain. There is one last cough from the darkness, only a stone's throw from our fire, then silence. Shaken but also high on his close encounter with a huge predator, we sort out our responses. The jaguar is probably just curious, though neither of us is eager to go out and ask the giant cat in the dark what he is thinking. What was this big feline doing checking out our fire? Our camp is certainly in his territory and probably on a preferred patrol route. We wondered what he's hunting, what he was seeking so close to our camp. Anyway, we didn't leave the fire much that night. Let's, anybody got any comments or questions? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned when you first started hiking around the Yellowstone that you didn't encounter hardly any people and there were fewer grizzlies. And now I think they're saying 600 grizzlies in the greater Yellowstone area. Do you have a sense of how their behavior is changing from your forays so deep into the wilderness? Most people only see them from the roads. And with the pandemic and all of that, there's so many more people going into the national parks. It's the experience we've had. We can hardly go into the parks anymore because there's just so much traffic. It's not fun.
Mm-hmm.
How are these millions of people that are going into Yellowstone going to impact them? Do you feel that they...
Well, yeah. I had the rare experience of being alone because I picked seasonally impossible travel situations. I would go in the early spring during pretty snowy years, and sometimes there's 4 feet of snow under the lodgepole in April or even early May. And it's just, for people, it's too late for skiing and too early for hiking. And all I can do is use snowshoes, and they only keep you up on top for, until about noon on average days, say. And then you wallow in the snow. I mean, it would take me like an hour to walk from the podium up to the front door. I mean, you just wallow, you break through every step. So you got to find a place to hang out during the middle of days, and I do that in terminal area. But the reason there weren't any people there. Now I think today, there is a micro niche at the roadside with bears who are fairly used to humans looking at them at least, and whatever the depth of that contact is. But I don't think it's terribly deep, and it doesn't affect them much. I think in the backcountry, if I were real people like, indulgent, wallowing human in the backcountry, I'd say, well, I got it all to myself. But the fact that you can still find niches of that same thing today, you just have to work for it. It takes a hard time to have a wilderness experience. You got to study maps and areas, and then get off trails and do all kinds of crazy things. But it's still possible. And I don't think, the basic behavior of grizzly bears has been affected, in short.
When we hike along the Graybull River and see the Frank's Peak and see these deep trails that are grizzly trails, and they're looking for those moth larvae, and are those hundreds of years old? Do you know?
No, wait a minute. Excuse me. Looking for the what?
Those moth larvae. The actual.
Oh, you mean you're talking about army cutworm moth?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Are those trails? Are they hundreds? Are they thousands?
No, I do not believe so, because that is, army cutworm moths are an ephemeral event. Even though if they've been there for year after year for a decade, they come from the from the wheat fields and agricultural areas of Alberta and Nebraska and everywhere else. And so, what those farmers spray upon their yards pretty much delineates the army cutworm behavior. It's not a natural thing. It's really dependent on pesticides and agriculture. and it's good bear food. And bears are such pioneers. You know, they can learn about and adjust to a new food source in a year or two. And with climate change and the total loss of white-barred pine nuts, the Grizzly and Yellowstone because of global warming, they're going to do all that they can. But you know, those things, first of all, they made a big deal about human discovering those things. Well, that's bullshit. You know, I mean, I was in Glacier Park a long time ago. I don't even know what, back, 50, 60 years ago. And for instance, up in the North Fork, mountain climbers would get up on Rainbow Peak and want to summit. They could never summit in the summertime. There could be half a dozen big bears up there eating cutworm moths in the 50s, And so, there's all these Newsweek articles about some doctor in Yellowstone discovering this phenomenon. It's just bullshit. And you find it all over the place, but it's fickle. And it doesn't happen year to year, and we can't depend on it. It's not a reliable food source. It's not like a pine nut. It depends upon sprays and climate change and agriculture. Anybody?
Hey, Thomas has a question back here, Mike.
Tomas.
Hi.
Hi.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you, brother.
Brother to brother, my question goes beyond all the lovely, extraordinary details of your book and back to the title. Was it worth it?
I'm going to indulge you with just reading the last paragraph of this book. Okay? Sorry, man. Oh, agony. I don't want no more. Okay. Somebody give me a half glass of wine. And here it is.
And give me the other half.
You got it. When it is indeed our time to walk off stage with the mammoths, the big one, what might be the measure of our character at the end of our tour? After, I'm looking into our own extinction here. This is a quandary. What might be the measure of our character at the end of our tour? After peering into the abyss, how do we behave? There is a great joy in doing the toil of the world, fighting for wild causes, saving pieces of the magnificent natural world. There's plenty of work. Do your job with decency and an open heart. Love your brothers and sisters in all actions, in all relationships. Speak the truth. Extend your innate empathy to distant tribes and strange animals. Arm yourself with friendship and love the earth. This is a little pedantic, but it's only one paragraph.
It's not pedantic.
Okay, that's all right, Tommy. Arm yourself with friendship and love the earth. Remember your duties. Walt Whitman said, resist much, obey little. Or, as Ed Abbey noted, a patriot must always be ready to defend his country against his government. Hold nothing back. Join the tribes in their dignified defense of native rights. An indigenous viewpoint should replace all notions of Western wildlife management. Respect this militant resistance and embrace the necessity of civil disobedience. What right isn't always legal and vice versa? Consider getting arrested. Who and what is at risk? If any past extinctions provide guidelines, then it's all life larger than a small meadow mouse. Now I can unpleasantly anticipate being among those minority humans left on earth to die from old age. I'd be happier if everyone could. It's a scourge in my geezerhood. I am unconcerned with my own death and fatally engaged in the lives of all my survivors. There is a bottomless, contradictory sadness and a fleeting glimpse of justice. Nature bats last. avenging the scorched earth, payback to Homo sapiens, bundled up in the loss of beauty and suffering in the lives of the people you love most. But then I watched a glacier grizzly walking slowly through a herd of elk, and that paid him no mind, nor got out of his way. And this goes on for a page and a half, and I'm up on the Grizzly Hill with Doug Seuss, and we're watching, we're watching eight, the two of us watching a circle of friends tightly gathered around a small water hole. Four swaying mother grizzly bears, 4 bear cubs, a yearling and 2 sub-adult grizzly bears, a prior litter of one of the moms. I mean, this is a herd of grizzlies around, a little water hole, not very tiny. Anyway, science doesn't admit this spectrum of behavior. The bears were dancing. It was worth it.